Hi guys! So, we've just circulated the prompt for the first writing assignment, and I know that for a lot of you this will be your very first time writing a philosophy paper. Some of you are perhaps freaking out a little. So I wanted to record this little bonus video for you with some tips and tricks on how to write a good philosophy paper. But before we get started, my most important message to you is relax. It's all going to be fine. Look, I'm wearing my best Hawaii shirt. What could possibly go wrong? So take a deep breath and then let's get started. Okay, I think the best way to think about how to write a good philosophy paper is to first say a few words about what a philosophy paper is. What are we trying to accomplish in writing philosophy? I think this is a pretty good working definition. A philosophy paper consists of the reasoned defense of some philosophical claim through arguments aimed at persuading the reader. So from this statement of what we're aiming to do in writing a philosophy paper, we can already derive what are, to my mind, the three cardinal virtues of good philosophical writing: clarity, precision, and persuasiveness. And from this, we already get our first piece of practical guidance. In writing philosophy, never sacrifice precision or clarity to stylistic considerations. Try to write in a simple, easy-to-follow style, even if to the artist in you that makes your prose appear a little plain. Also, try to make the overall structure of your argument maximally perspicuous, as transparent as possible. I'll give you a few tips on how to do that in just a moment. Finally, don't be afraid of repetitions and other inelegancies. Sometimes in English composition seminars, you're told that it's a no-no to reuse the verb or noun, the same verb or noun in too many consecutive sentences, because doing so makes your prose inelegant. Instead, you're told to use synonyms to try and vary your prose. Forget that advice when you're doing philosophy. Don't think, for example, because you've used the term right in the previous sentence that you should now use, say, prerogative, because repeating the same word would make your writing inelegant. Stylistic elegance is a virtue in writing philosophy, but it's strictly secondary to clarity and precision. And since for many philosophers the term right and prerogative aren't actually synonyms, it would be a bad idea to potentially confuse your reader by using varying expressions when you actually mean to convey the same idea. As for the third cardinal virtue, persuasiveness, here's some practical advice on how to achieve that. In writing philosophy, don't beg the question by already assuming the truth of what you're trying to show. But likewise, we've already talked about this in earlier lectures, don't base your argument on controversial religious or political views of yours that your reader is unlikely to share. You want the potential audience for your argument to be as large as possible. So you want to base it on premises that as many people as possible will be willing to grant you. At the same time, when it comes to the conclusion of your paper, don't sit on the fence. Sometimes you reach the end of an undergraduate paper, and in the very last paragraph, the student is saying, well, on the one hand this, on the other hand that, and then nothing. Don't be that guy. Set out to defend a clear, well-defined conclusion. Now, that doesn't mean that your conclusion can't be nuanced, but it is important that your reader not be left in doubt where you stand. And let me expand a little on these points by taking you through some of the parts of a philosophy paper. Let's begin at the beginning with the introduction. In the introduction, you want to announce what you will do and how you will do it. Don't keep the reader in suspense about what your conclusion will be. In that respect, philosophy is again different from some literature. In fact, you can usefully think of your philosophy paper as a kind of anti-mystery novel. So, if Agatha Christie had been a philosopher, her novels would have begun like this. In this novel, I will show that it was the butler who did it, using the poker in the drawing room. The excitement in reading a Flossie paper comes from seeing how the author is going to establish her conclusion, what interesting arguments she'll deploy. It shouldn't come from having no clue until the end what the conclusion is going to be. Second point. In a paper of only 1,000 words, you have no words to waste, so get right to the point. There's really no need for long, florid wind-ups. Basically, start answering the question contained in the prompt right away. Definitely avoid platitudes and waffle. Flossers are really allergic to that. Please know, since the dawn of time, when we first descended from the trees, mankind has pondered the immortal question, and so on. Yuck! By contrast, the introduction is a good place to introduce definitions that will be needed later in the paper. Also, use abbreviations if that's helpful and will save you words later on. So, for example, the first time you employ a term like act utilitarianism, you might say, act utilitarianism, henceforth abbreviated as AU, is the view that the right action in a given situation is that which produces the greatest balance of well-being over ill-being. All right, let's move on to the main body of your paper and to how to make that as clear as possible. Well, at a micro level, one good piece of advice is to try and identify all premises in your argument and then try to defend them as fully as possible. In doing that, it may help to map out your argument in the form of numbered propositions. Indeed, your preceptors will smile on that, I predict. I think it's charlatans and people who are intellectually unconfident who try and make their writing obscure and ambiguous. If you're confident of what you have to say, why would you not want to make it as easy to understand and your reasoning as easy to check as possible? So do feel free to use the method of numbered propositions, which I've been modeling for you in lecture in your own essays. At a macro level, try and make the overall structure of your essay as perspicuous as possible. A good way to do that is to use transitional phrases such as the following. I will begin by ... Before I say what is wrong with author X's argument, I will first ... At this point, we need to consider the following objection ... In this section, I will... so on. In the next section, I will ... blah, blah, blah. Having argued for the view that... I will now consider rival views. Although I have shown ... I still need to prove ... Next, I will offer support for what is perhaps my most controversial assumption, namely that ... And so on. Basically, you're like a pool player calling his shots before he attempts them. By making the argumentative structure of your paper explicit, you make it easier for a reader to follow along, and also to check your reasoning. Again, if you have something important and true to say, why would you not want to be as clear as possible? So if you follow this advice, then the overall skeleton of the main section of a good Flossie paper may look something like this, what is shown over here on this slide. I'm not going to read this out for you, but why don't you pause the video and take a look. I say this is the skeleton because we've stripped out all actual content in this example. It's really just about showing you the argumentative structure of the paper. Let me now say a few words about the second cardinal virtue, namely precision. In writing Flossie, it's a very good idea to define or briefly explain key technical terms, since these are often used in subtly different ways by different authors. Another important piece of advice is to avoid overstatement and exaggeration. Be especially careful with pronouns such as every, all, none, never, and so on. Flossers are always on the lookout for such words because this is the point in an argument where it's often possible to come up with counterexamples. And believe me, your preceptors who will grade your papers are pretty good at finding counterexamples. So don't say that something is always or never the case unless you're really sure of what you're saying. Also, avoid vagueness and avoid ambiguity in your writing. Many words, such as the word right, for example, have more than one meaning. So the sentence, Peter has a right to do X, might mean that Peter has a moral right to do X. Or it might mean that Peter has a legal right to do X. These are not the same thing. Doing X may be morally permissible, even though Steve has no legal right to do so, and vice versa. So be clear about what you mean. Finally, when you're criticizing someone else's views, be as charitable to their position as possible. That is, if what they say admits of different possible interpretations, use the interpretation that makes their claim strongest and most interesting, and work with that. By contrast, as the philosopher Jim Pryor says in his really excellent Guidelines to Writing a Philosophy paper, from which I'm liberally borrowing in this presentation, a good way to summarize the advice about clarity and precision that I've been giving you is by assuming that your reader won't be charitable to you. So Pryor writes in a really wonderful passage, pretend that your reader has not read the material you're discussing and has not given the topic much thought in advance. This will of course not be true, but if you write as if it were true, it will force you to explain any technical terms, to illustrate strange or obscure distinctions, and to be as explicit as possible when you summarize what some other philosopher said. In fact, you can profitably take this one step further and pretend that your reader is lazy, stupid, and mean. He's lazy in that he doesn't want to figure out what your convoluted sentences are supposed to mean, and he doesn't want to figure out what your argument is if it's not already obvious. He's stupid, so you have to explain everything you say to him in simple, bite-sized pieces. And he's mean, so he's not going to read your paper charitably. For example, if something you say admits of more than one interpretation, he's going to assume you meant the less plausible thing. End of quote. By the way, there's a link to Pryor's piece on the syllabus in case you want to read the whole thing, which I really highly recommend you do. All right, let's go on. In writing philosophy, you'll often be engaging with the arguments of other people. And a good deal of doing philosophy is criticizing other people's arguments. So let me say a few words about how to do that well. Well, to object to an argument, you must give reasons why it is flawed. Now, there are a number of different ways in which an argument can be flawed. It might be that the premises don't support the conclusion. In other words, the argument isn't valid. Or it might be that one or more of the premises, either normative or factual, is false. In that case, the argument is unsound. It might be that the argument articulates a principle that makes sense in this case, but would have implausible implications for other cases. This is a way of saying that the principle isn't true in general, and hence that one of the argument's premises is false. It might be that the argument slides from one meaning of a term to another. Philosophers have a technical term for this. We call it equivocation. This typically means that there's a flaw in the logical structure of the argument, and so an argument that equivocates is typically invalid. Finally, the argument might make a comparison that doesn't really hold. Now, in moral philosophy, a lot of the claims you will be discussing are moral or normative claims. So let's talk about different ways in which you might try to show that the moral claim made by some author is false. First, you could employ a reductio ad absurdum strategy. That is, you could try to show that a principle, if applied to a different case or taken to its logical conclusion, has unacceptable implications. We saw how John Torek tried to do this in Should the Numbers Count? He tried to show that the thesis of moral aggregation was false by suggesting that it would have intuitively unpalatable implications for his David case. Second, and relatedly, you could try and find a counterexample. That is, you could present a concrete case in which the principle in question seems to imply something false. Judy Thomson's paper on the trolley problem is a prime example of that. Prior to Thomson, many philosophers believe that, all else equal, it is always wrong to kill an innocent person to save 5 lives. Then Thomson presented her bystander case, and many people were forced to change their minds because the case struck many as a counterexample to the general thesis. Third, you could try and show that the principle in question is inconsistent with other commitments of the speaker, or at least with other commitments that they ought to have. Peter Singer employs this strategy in Famine, Affluence, and Morality. He makes the case that the principle that giving to charity is morally optional is very hard to square with other confident moral beliefs of ours, such as the belief that you are morally required to rescue a child drowning in a shallow pond. Fourth, you could try and explain away the attractiveness of the principle. That is, you could show that the attractive conclusions that the principle implies can also be gotten from other principles which do not have the same unattractive implications. Finally, you could try debunking the principle. That is, you could give a causal explanation of why people hold the principle belief in question, which at the same time suggests that it may be false. We saw how Joshua Green and Peter Singer tried to do this for our intuition about the large man version of the trolley problem. I think that this strategy is quite hard to do well, so I don't really recommend it to you for your first papers. All right, here are a couple of other assorted tips for writing philosophy. Always ask yourself, does your argument rest on factual assumptions that your opponent would reject? Try to avoid that. It's a form of begging the question against your opponent. Also ask, does your argument make overly optimistic or overly pessimistic assumptions that are designed to help your case? Again, don't do that either for similar reasons. At the same time, when doing moral philosophy, don't get hung up on nitpicking the factual assumptions in an opponent's argument. Yes, many modern trolleys have fail-safe mechanisms that will automatically bring the trolley to a stop if the driver loses control or becomes incapacitated. But that's not really the point of the trolley problem, is it? Also, ask yourself, are you perhaps defending a stronger claim than you have to? Don't do that, since in that case you're just begging for someone to find a counterexample to what you're saying. To stay on the safe side, qualify your claims. Use phrases like all other things equal to avoid overextending yourself. And finally, a pet peeve of mine in bad undergraduate writing. Avoid positing entailments when they don't exist. For example, don't write thus, hence, consequently, when you don't actually believe that what comes now logically follows from what you said before. Let me say a few words about how to work with texts. I would like you to use the assigned texts to inform and nourish your own philosophical reflection on the assigned topic. So please avoid simply summarizing what other people have written on a question. Likewise, definitely avoid arguments from authority. They cut no ice in philosophy. Instead, mention the readings as a means to making your own case, for instance, by objecting to them. But even if you agree with what another author has said and want to borrow some of their points, which is totally okay, by the way, make sure to present these points in your own voice as something that you yourself stand behind and are asserting, not just as something that you're reporting them as having said, like in a book report. It goes without saying that you should cite all the sources that you quote. To do that, use either footnotes or in-text references. If you do the latter, then include a bibliography at the end of your paper. Okay, a few practical matters. All papers must be emailed to your preceptor by 11:59 p.m. on October 4th. To ensure that our grading is as fair and free of bias as possible, we would like all papers to be submitted anonymously. You'll be receiving further instructions by email on how to prepare your paper for anonymous submission, so be on the lookout for that. Please also include a word count at the end of your paper, which should exclude bibliographical references. They don't count. Papers mustn't exceed 1,000 words for this first writing assignment. All right, some final pieces of advice. I advise you to start drafting your paper early and to do at least 2 drafts. They say that the way to take a perfect photograph is to take about 100 and then select the one that's good. Well, the way to write a really good flossy paper is to do many drafts and incrementally improve it. So leave enough time and start early. A very good way to see if your paper flows well is to read it out loud. Even better, show it to a friend or a sibling and ask them to read it. This will help you identify unclear spots or gaps in the argument. And finally, to return where we began, don't forget to relax.